History often forgets the voices of the oppressed, but it remembers the arrogance of kings who defied divine justice. If you have really considered some accounts of historical facts within the context of Egyptian rule, you would have heard about the name Thutmose III. In ancient Egypt's majestic 18th dynasty, Thutmose III, a child of Pharaoh, was placed under the regency of Hatshepsut, his stepmother and aunt. Hatshepsut crowned herself Pharaoh, an almost unprecedented move for a woman, and ruled for over 20 years. The question is, why was such a move? It was likely to block Moses' succession to the Egyptian throne. As a Hebrew raised in Pharaoh's palace and adopted by Hatshepsut herself, of course, according to several Egyptologists who are historians who write about Egypt and biblical historians, Moses was a legitimate heir to the throne. His intellect, military training, and influence among Egyptians and Hebrews alike made him a threat to dynastic plans. So when he killed an Egyptian and fled into exile, according to the records of Exodus, a youthful Thutmose, who was still in the shadow of regency, watched the prince of Egypt disappear into the desert. By the time Moses returned 40 years later, Thutmose III had become Egypt's Napoleon. How? He was commanding 17 known military campaigns and expanding Egypt's empire to its greatest territorial reach. His throne was secure, his pride unchallenged, and his memory, well, immortalized in Karnak's stone reliefs. Yet, when Moses returned, he came not as a rival king, but as a messenger of Yahweh, and his message struck at the core of Egypt's power. Let my people go. Welcome back as we unravel very important historical facts regarding the dynasty and monarchical system of Egypt. Of course, trying to understand one of the most important recordings ever in the Pentateuch, the second book, Exodus. As we progress, let us begin by trying to discover the request and the responses associated with "Let my people go." If you carefully read through the records of the second book of the 5 books of Moses, Exodus, you would have come across chapter 5, which clearly depicts the reign of a particular Pharaoh representing the Egyptian monarchical system as against the divine leadership of God with the Israelites. In Pharaoh's response to what Moses presented to him, "Let my people go," we see Thutmose III, who is a child and had been placed on the throne under the regency of Hatshepsut, basically to prevent Moses from being proclaimed Pharaoh. We do know previously, in the various chapters preceding chapter 5, Moses, who had murdered an Egyptian, had fled Egypt, and that time was when Thutmose was just about still a teenager. 40 years on. Biblically, historians also accent to the fact that Moses found himself back in the court. The question is, had he come to claim his right to the throne? Well, not at all. The request was simple: "Let my people go." And so fascinatingly, Thutmose's response is a challenge, not to Moses, but to God himself. In short, he was challenging God's very existence. And we perfectly unravel the fact that his attitude is used in Revelation as a symbol to represent the French nation during the 18th century revolution. You can confirm this in the 11th chapter of Revelation and the 8th verse. Like Pharaoh, the French Republic declared religion abolished and declared itself an atheistic nation. How then did the people themselves also respond to Moses' call? Do you know that when Moses performed the signs that God had given him before the people, they believed and worshipped? Well, initially they did. And it is noteworthy that we can imagine how eagerly they waited for Pharaoh's response to their request. The response that came was truly unexpected. Pharaoh not only refused but forced them to do the work without giving them the necessary materials. Slavery, but demanding the same results. What was the excuse for imposing such an irrational order? Moses and Aaron, as we have seen, according to Thutmose, made them rest. In other words, they had given the people Shabbat in the Hebrew language, which means rest from their labors. In other words, Thutmose was basically saying, if the people of Israel had time to talk about religion and freedom, then they would also have time to look for straw. Basically saying they should go find straw by themselves. Then when the Israelites were mistreated, the taskmasters complained to Pharaoh, but they were ignored. That is the twist of the story. They then turned against Moses and Aaron, accusing them of making their situation worse. Before I continue, maybe it is important for me to highlight some very important notes with regards to slavery and what it has gone through within the ages. You have to understand that Moses was not the only figure in history to return stronger from exile. Historically, there are several big names who were exiled at a point, or, in the context of Moses, fled their original abode but came back. Examples: Napoleon Bonaparte was exiled to Elba in 1814 after being deposed. He escaped, rallied an army, and returned to France in 1815 to reclaim power in the famous 100 Days. Well, it never ended well because he was defeated at Waterloo. In the Roman archives, Julius Caesar, once forced to flee Rome due to political enemies, returned and crossed the Rubicon, sparking civil war and seizing absolute power. In the various banks of Eastern Africa, we see in the land of Ethiopia Haile Selassie I, who was exiled during Benito Mussolini's 1936 invasion. He returned after World War II, of course with the British support, and reclaimed his throne, becoming a global symbol of resistance and African sovereignty. To the Middle East, in Iran, a name is very popular in the person of Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini was banished from Iran by the Shah, but he returned in 1979 and led what is now known as the Islamic Revolution in the Middle East, forever changing the region's religious and political landscape. You can see clearly from all these accounts that each of these men returned, like Moses, came to redefine systems. So did Moses, but not with armies nor swords. He returned with signs and a staff, and the God Pharaoh claimed not to know. Let's proceed. Now, I think it's quite important that we consider also the response of God. The narrative, it is not just the people who are not happy with Moses. Remember, Pharaoh gets angry with him. The people get angry. But Moses isn't angry. He is just dismayed. He turns to the originator of the message with his doubts. Why are you afflicting these people? Why did you send me? Direct question to God. But let's examine God's response. God answers him by saying two very distinct and important messages. What have I done? And what will I do? And what have I done? God basically tells Moses, I appeared to the prophets. Not only that, he establishes a covenant with them. And he tells him he promised to give them the land of Canaan. Of course, he has heard the moans of his people, and he has remembered his promise. In consequence to what he has done, this is what he will do. He is reiterating the fact that he will remove the oppression of the Egyptians from them. Again, he will free them from slavery, and he will deploy his power. He's going to make them his people, and he will be their God by giving them the land of Canaan. Very important assertions which God actually gave to Moses to reiterate that he was the originator of the message. It is equally important to quickly discuss the significance of the story we are talking about in the context of slavery. Do you know that throughout history, nations that relied on the brutal labor of others for wealth and empire often sowed the seeds of their own undoing? Ancient Egypt, for example, with its pyramids and monuments, was largely built by slave labor, the Hebrew and foreigners alike. It became the richest kingdom of its time. Yet, as Exodus recounts, it took only 10 plagues and the Red Sea crossing for its enslaved workforce to walk free, leaving its economy in ruins and its army drowned. Let me talk also about the mighty iron monarchical rule of the Roman Empire. The Empire of Rome depended on millions of slaves captured through war and other conquests. But we record revolts like that of Spartacus in 73 to 71 BC, where they shook Rome's foundation, revealing how fragile power can be when it's built on oppression. More recently, of course, in the context of history, the Atlantic slave empires, Portugal, Britain, France, and Spain, built vast wealth through the transatlantic slave trade. Yet in time, their colonies, enriched by the same labor, rose in rebellion. For example, Haiti's successful slave revolt in 1791 through 1804, led by Toussaint Louverture, shook the world and inspired freedom movements across the Americas. Up a bit north, in the southern part of America, whose wealth was deeply rooted in enslaved labor, collapsed economically after the Civil War and emancipation. That wealth earned on the backs of the oppressed rarely lasts. Freedom always knocks again. And here, I would like to dwell on the response of Moses himself. After God's encouraging words, Moses again speaks to the people, but of course, as expected, they do not listen. And he is asked to speak to Pharaoh again to ask for Israel's freedom. Well, as humans would expect, Moses refused, and he again reiterated his excuses that he had said a few moments earlier. As a man, he was down, depressed, disappointed, but like other great figures who felt the same way he did, such as Asaph and Job, he did not give in to despair. His trust in God was stronger than his current feelings. The role of Moses and Aaron. So, as we go through the story, we see that after the initial failures in Egypt, it was prudent that Moses was reminded again of Aaron's role as his helper. On this occasion, God used a comparison with the role of prophets, which is they receiving a message from God and transmitting to us. In this sense, God told Moses that he, Moses, would play the role of God and Aaron the role of a prophet. And as we will see happening in many of the occurrences within the records of Exodus, God warned that his message would not be heard and that he would have to act with great power. Like later prophets, Moses was to speak to the people and Pharaoh, whether they listen or turn away, for they are rebellious. And today it is also true of us, for we can clearly see, historically, biblically, that the audible voice of God is we on the earth.